Well, if by liberal Islam or liberalism, among Muslims, if we mean that if this happens, Muslims will think that everything in the world is wonderful and they have nothing to object. No, this is not going to happen. This doesn't have to happen. A pious Muslim will always find some things in the world morally unacceptable. He will not. He will think that atheism is wrong to begin with. He will want to see his religion respected. He won't like cartoons about Prophet Muhammad. He won't. Maybe he will be quite conservative when it comes to gender issues. He will think the family is very important. Maybe will value family, and sometimes make some concessions from from an individualistic perspective. And he won't like to see alcohol around. I mean, that's, I think, fact of life. There are very Christian, conservative Christians in the United States. They're against abortion. They're against even alcohol is discussed in the Bible Belt, and there are some, there are some limitations and so on. So there will be all these things, and I think it is first not realistic to argue Muslims to abandon what they think, about these things. Secondly, it's not right. People have the right to think that some things are sin, some things are immoral. The question is, do they impose this? A Muslim can think alcohol is something terrible and he should never drink it, and those people who drink it are doing something wrong. He can think that. The question is, does he want to capture the state to ban alcohol for everybody? Or maybe he can have a bias towards homosexual people and can think that, well, I don't want a homosexual friend, that's his perspective. The question is, does he want to punish them and put them in prison or, flog them or something? And in my book, I'm showing that Muslims will have their moral values and some rigid maybe moral stances. That's not a problem, but they should not, coerce people to subscribe to them. And I think we can make that distinction when we look at Islamic texts. And from a Quranic perspective, I made the distinction between crime and sin, for example. Muslims will not appreciate sin, but sin should be free. Because refraining from sin should be a religious obligation, not an obligation imposed you by the state. In Turkey, is this accepted by the pious Muslims? Well, there's a debate going on. I'm actually within the debate right now in Turkey. I'm writing about these things in Turkish as well. And within the pious Islamic community in Turkey, there is, I would say, a more liberal trend or liberal wing which likes what I'm saying about these things, which says, yes, there should be a freedom to sin. There's a more rigid camp, which is a little more skeptical. They understand that this is practical in the modern world. You have to tolerate these things, but on principle, they're not that willing to change. But I think the dynamics of change are there. Turkish Islam is much more open-minded than it was 10 years ago. It's much more open-minded than it was 20 years ago. And I think 10 years from now, things will be changing even more and changing towards a more liberal perspective among Muslims. In Turkey, there are many individualistic pious Muslims who don't subscribe to any particular group, but there are also particular Islamic communities. And these can be divided into two basic groups. One, the traditional tariqats, the Sufi orders, whose practices go back to centuries, ago, and whose practices are very much about piety and worshiping God and reciting God's name thousands of times in a night. Those sort of very old rituals, and morally they're very conservative, and they're not very much exposed to the modern world. They're living kind of their own cultural ghettos. And in Istanbul, there are neighborhoods that you can go and see the people who have long beards and who who wear maybe turban and whose wives wear a very black chador and so on. And I defend those people to live that way. They're right. In an open society, you should have the ultra-Orthodox as well, like you have Orthodox Jews, I think, in the U.S. or in Israel. Besides those very conservative communities, but these are small communities and they're getting less and less influential because they're very archaic in most senses when it comes to the modern world. There are other communities which are not old-fashioned Sufi orders. They're more modern in the sense that they're more dynamic and active in life. And their Islam is either centered on the ideas or the personal charisma of a leader. And we should mention two individuals here. One is Said Nursi, and another, he's a Muslim intellectual and scholar I have great respect for. Nursi died in 1960, so he was a late Ottoman thinker who lived until 1960s. And he criticized Kemalism and he criticized the secularist tendencies of the regime. But he focused on defending the Islamic faith and defending Islamic morality through books. All he did was to write books. And these are totally peaceful, non-political books which focus on Islamic theology and Islamic faith and practice and morality. And those books created a following. There are millions of people who read Nursi's books. This is an intellectual movement in the sense that all they do is to read the books, publish them, write articles about them, and they are more, I would say, exposed to the modern world in that sense. And the other thing is, Nursi never became a critique of democracy. He actually supported democracy from the very beginning, because he knew that from the Ottoman times that a parliament is a good idea. And he supported the democratic movement in Turkey, and he supported center-right political parties, and his followers have done as well. So this tradition have always objected to the idea of an Islamic state. They said there should be a democratic state which respects our values. They never, for example, supported the Erbakan movement in Turkey, which was Islamist in its ideology. They always preferred leaders like Turgut Özal or Demirel in the 60s or Menderes in the 50s. These are the center-right political leaders in Turkey. And from that, so Nur movement can be said to be more modern and more democratic-minded. And they certainly were not political Islamists. And the Islamists always made fun of them as being too wishy-washy or being not rigid enough or talking about God and nature and love all the time instead of dealing with issues of Islamic State. Among the Nur community, a particular, branch became very popular and very big, and that's the branch led by Fethullah Gülen, the preacher who now lives in the United States since 1998. And they, I would say, updated the Nur movement to some extent and added Gülen's personal charisma to this. And they created this big, very powerful Islamic community in Turkey with millions of followers. They have, taking an example from the Catholics, I would say, they decided to have an Islamic missionary movement through schools. So they have opened up schools in 100 countries in the world, more than 100 countries, 1,000 schools from Vietnam to United States. These schools give very good education, modern education, it's not religious education. Teachers only give a religious spirit by example, to their students, like a Jesuit, school would do, I guess. And they also have a big media empire, several newspapers in Turkey, and they have promoted tolerance to Christians. They have promoted Turkey's EU integration. They are even critical of strong anti-Israeli sentiment in Turkey. And for example, when the Mavi Marmara, the Gaza flotilla, went to Israel and was attacked by Israel soldiers, Fethullah Gülen, the leader of this Islamic community, he was sorry for all the loss, but he also criticized the flotilla for going to a clash with Israel. He said, they should have found a more, reconciliatory solution with Israeli authorities. So politically, it's a very moderate group, to use that term, which is very much used in the West. And they certainly are supportive of democratization in Turkey. I think there's change within Islamic individuals, but there's change within the Islamic communities as well. And especially the Gülen community, which is the largest and the most influential and most decisive Islamic group in Turkey, is quite welcome. I mean, when you look at it from a liberal democratic perspective. First of all, Turkey's secularists are like an interesting group. I mean, they're not Western liberals. Their notion of secularism comes from the philosophy called positivism, the philosophy of called German Vulgarmaterialismus of the 19th century, things that Ataturk acquired from the West in the 20s and 30s, not today. And so they believe in a secularism which really doesn't give much room for religious freedom. And they think that secularism means not the state, but also the society should be secularized by the state's authoritarian measures. And so they wouldn't accept many things that would be free in a religious society, in a free society. So they have this bizarre notion of secularism, which I sometimes call secular fundamentalism. And for a long time, they did not appreciate democracy because they thought democracy brings the wrong people to power. So their secularism was something which saw democracy as a threat. And in the face of this, the conservatives in Turkey actually, over time, as they understood things better, actually liked democracy, supported democracy, and clung on to democracy. And that's why, for example, in the past year's discussions, when you look at the terms of the debate, the secularists were speaking about secularism, whereas the conservative camp and the liberals who side with them were speaking about democracy. So these things are not, from a Western perspective, people might think secularism equals democracy. It doesn't work that way in Turkey. But why there is this fierce debate? First of all, I think there is something which is true for all Turks. That is belief in conspiracy theories and belief in evil enemies everywhere. I think the secularists believe that the Islamists have a hidden goal, whereas the Islamic camp believe that the secularists have a hidden goal and deep structures and some unseen designs out there. There's also this problem that I call the Turkish doctrine of preemptive intolerance, which means that you will not tolerate people even if they want something legitimate, because if you tolerate that, they will want something more. And I think the secularists' approach, they had the same approach on the Kurdish question as well, because the people we call secularists in Turkey, the Kemalists, were also the ones who were holding the stakes on the Kurdish issue. And for example, they did not want to allow the Kurds to speak their language even on the streets, because they thought if they speak their language, they will want a Kurdistan. So you will not tolerate even the reasonable things. But ultimately, people want a Kurdistan if you actually don't allow them to speak Kurdish in Turkey. So I think you should give them more freedom in Turkey in order to tame the ethno-nationalistic tendencies there. So I think because of these kind of vicious, because of these dogmatic positions, I think the secularists had, they did not want to tolerate even the most reasonable, I think, demands of the Islamic camp and the Kurdish camp. But I think Turkey is getting over that excessive secularism. And now even the secularists are understanding that the AKP really doesn't want to bring Islamic rule to Turkey. They will not make Turkey a Sharia state. But there are legitimate questions in terms of conservatism in public life. They are more now critical of AKP's grip on power. And I think that's a more legitimate question. I don't think Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey wants a Islamic state. I don't think AKP wants that. But the very simple fact that this is a party which is in power for 3 terms and which doesn't have a legitimate, reasonable, promising opposition has an impact on this party. It makes them too self-confident. Power corrupts. It corrupts everybody. So there are legitimate questions that the secularist camp sometimes raise against the AKP. But these are questions about the normal trends in politics, not about something about an Islamic state. Well, if by liberal Islam or liberalism, among Muslims, if we mean that if this happens, Muslims will think that everything in the world is wonderful and they have nothing to object. Maybe he will be quite conservative when it comes to gender issues. He will think the family is very important. Maybe will value family and sometimes make some concessions from an individualistic perspective. And he won't abandon what they think, about these things. Secondly, it's not right. People have the right to think that some things are sin, some things are immoral. The question is, do they impose this? A Muslim can think alcohol is something terrible and he should never drink it, and those people who drink it are doing something wrong. He can think that. To see alcohol around, that's, I think, fact of life. There are very Christian, conservative Christians in the United States, they're against abortion, they're against, even alcohol is discussed in the Bible Belt, and there are some, there are some limitations and so on. So there will be all these things, and I think it is first not realistic to argue Muslims to, no, this is not going to happen, this doesn't have to happen. A pious Muslim will always find some things in the world morally unacceptable. He will think that atheism is wrong to begin with. He will want to see his religion respected. He won't like cartoons about Prophet Muhammad. He